Good evening, everyone. You're watching The Project. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Jennah.
And tonight we are talking about mental health challenges in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or ATSI, communities. On the 13th of February in 2008, the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Kevin Rudd, apologised to the Stolen Generation people on behalf of the Parliament and people of Australia. Former ATSI Social Justice Commissioner Tom Karma spoke for many when he said, "Let the healing begin." A major component of this healing involves closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous healthcare. Mental health issues are one of the leading causes of the Indigenous health gap, second only to cardiac disease. ATSI peoples experience higher rates of mental health issues than other Australians, with deaths from suicide twice as high and rates of high psychological distress almost 3 times as high as for other Australians.
ATSI peoples have experienced a long history of mistreatment by mainstream health and welfare services and have become understandably mistrustful and fearful of contact with them. Historically, diagnoses of mental health problems have been used to disempower and disadvantage those from marginalised groups. And unfortunately, this gives ATSI peoples a strong reason to avoid contact with mental health services. Today, multiple organisations are working together to initiate culturally appropriate mental health care that can be provided to ATSI peoples, regardless of geographical location and language group. Tonight, we look forward to hearing from a few different perspectives on this topic.
Earlier this week, we were fortunate enough to talk to Auntie Alice Kolasa, a Wurundjeri elder, about Indigenous understandings of mental health and how these factors might affect how psychological services can be delivered. Here's what she had to say.
Hi, I'm Alice Kolasa, Wurundjeri elder and a traditional owner of the land upon which we stand. Today I'm here to speak for my clan, the Wurundjeri people, but I am also here to represent the First Peoples of this country.
In your opinion, Alice, how is mental health understood in the ATSI communities, and how might this understanding affect the delivery of psychological services to ATSI people?
For us, mental health is not an individual aspect of general health in the perspective that is an illness which we need to cure. We approach mental health holistically, involving the social, emotional, spiritual and cultural life of peoples and communities. To look after someone from the ATSI communities who are experiencing mental health issues, you need to understand the culture that they come from. Strong spirit, strong mind is a concept where we discuss well-being as encompassing the body, mind and spirit. It is important to fully understand this holistic idea of health in order to successfully and sensitively offer psychological services.
Strong spirit, strong mind. That's an interesting concept. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Mind, body and spirit speak as one for my people. We hold spirituality as a cultural context. It is all about the ongoing connection between past, current and future generations. We elders play an important part in helping our people keep their connection to culture and country. This holds a great importance for a mentally healthy well-being.
You bring up some great points, Alice. In your opinion, from the mental health practitioner's perspective, what do you think they need to be mindful of when administering psychological services?
To look after our people in our communities who are experiencing mental health difficulties, we need to understand the culture that we come from. Our connection to our country make up who we are, and misdiagnoses can occur if this is not taken into account. For example, people from our community and other ATSI communities speak to the spirits of our ancestors. From an outsider's perspective, we may seem like we are talking to ourselves and hallucinating. From our perspective, this is as normal as it would be seeing someone praying to God in the church. Inappropriate assessments resulting in poor test outcomes not only perpetuate the marginalisation of our peoples, but can result in inadequate treatment and access to appropriate services. This is why assessments need to take into consideration individual family and community factors to avoid wrong diagnoses.
So with everything you've just mentioned, what do you think the best approach might be to providing appropriate mental health services to ATSI communities, regardless of the language they speak or their geographical location?
Well, we respond better to a more narrative therapy approach that allows us to tell our stories. Cultural translation of therapies really helps this communication. For example, there has been a culturally translated version of cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, which has been used in my community as a means to reach and help my people in a way that they can understand and relate to. It is called Bush CBT and used a lot in bushwork, which really helps rural communities that are geographically isolated. It has not been properly developed yet and is still in a work in progress, but our communities would really benefit from more effort being put into culturally translating treatments such as this. Community development empowerment is another way of helping those who are experiencing mental health difficulties. Many communities experience very high levels of stress in economic, environmental, physical, social and emotional areas. This stress to the community weighs down on people as well. Improving the general health and well-being of the communities will improve the health and well-being of individual members, and I believe will improve the mental state of ATI members as a whole.
Thank you so much, Alice. It was great to hear your perspective on this important issue.
Dr. Marissa Fields holds a PhD in clinical psychology and is renowned for her work in ATSI mental health and cultural competency, and she joins us now. Marissa, you've begun promoting and providing training for Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals to become psychologists. Why is this something you're so passionate about?
I am passionate about this because the way a psychologist approaches the care and treatment of Indigenous people has substantial implications for outcomes, and of course we want positive outcomes. I know my experience and view of the world is not the same as my Indigenous clients. I constantly remind myself to leave my own assumptions and prejudices at home. To deny these inherent and unavoidable assumptions and prejudices exist is unhelpful and negatively affects the client-psychologist relationship, and in turn, how effective treatment will be. In this context, training for Indigenous psychologists is really important. Some Indigenous clients will feel more comfortable talking to an Indigenous psychologist because they have an inherent understanding of the customs, culture, traditions, and history of Indigenous people, which can build and create trust in a therapeutic relationship. However, regardless of whether the psychologist is Indigenous or non-Indigenous, the most important qualities a psychologist must have are empathy, understanding, sensitivity, and respect.
Can you go into a bit more detail about what these qualities involve?
These qualities can be expressed in a number of different ways. For example, ATSI people in marginalised communities have become particularly sensitised to judgmental attitudes. Therefore, when a psychologist enters into a marginalised community, they are very closely watched in relation to posture, facial expressions and attitudes. If you are a psychologist who's entering a community and you appear judgmental, ATSI people will be able to sense this instantly. If you enter in a community and you appear open-minded, not judgmental and accepting, this will have significant positive implications for your place as a psychologist and the outcomes of your work in the community. If you have this approach, you'll be quickly forgiven for any cultural misunderstandings you make as a non-Indigenous person. ATSI peoples are aware that you may know little about kinship, law, land and spirituality, but are very happy to teach you these important aspects of their lives.
Do ATSI peoples have different understandings of the mental health system in terms of treatment and consultations?
So for ATSI people, mental health is holistic and collaborative and includes social, emotional, spiritual and cultural aspects of themselves and the community. For non-Indigenous Australians, treatment and consultation are generally quite individualistic. For Indigenous Australians, the therapeutic relationship consists of themselves, the psychologist, family members and the community.
Can you give us some specific examples of this?
Well, when you first begin a consultation, often the Indigenous client will ask you where you come from, where you fit in the community, and will often ask about family members. They will tell you these aspects about themselves as well. It is important to also ask what they want to be called, either an Indigenous or Aboriginal person or by a certain name. They do this because within Indigenous culture, family and community are incredibly important aspects of their lives, and often they see themselves as being in a group more so than being an individual person. By asking you these questions, they can place you in the context of your family and community in order to understand and relate to you more. It is also essential to work with Indigenous mental health workers and primary health workers for greater understanding in relation to language and culture.
So Marissa, do you think gender of the psychologist plays a bigger role in ATSI people's accessing mental health care in comparison to non-ATSI communities?
So gender of the psychologist is very relevant in the Indigenous community. If I'm talking to a woman, it is much more likely that they will discuss personal issues with me. However, if I'm talking to a man, then they are much less likely to open up about aspects such as sexuality or relationship problems, as I'm a female. It is common that both females and males will bring mothers or mother figures or aunties to consultations too, especially if the psychologist is of the opposite sex to them. Often, there are general rules in the community about who you can tell women's business or men's business to, which are generally the same gender, as this is what is culturally appropriate and accepted in the Indigenous community.
You seem to have your own viewpoint, Marissa, on what the most important qualities of a psychologist should be to deliver the most effective treatment outcomes in ATSI communities. Does the Australian Psychological Society, or APS, share the same viewpoint as you?
Well, in fact, the APS has specifically created ethical guidelines for the provision of psychological services for and the conduct of research with ATSI peoples. The guidelines promote culturally appropriate services for working with this community, including the following. So there's respect for justice, which is of course crucial. This includes the importance of taking into account a client's ethnicity and culture, which could extend to their skin group, mob group, or community group. It is recommended that psychological services are provided in a collaborative exercise between the psychologist and the Indigenous client. Avoiding discrimination and ensuring that psychologists show acknowledgement and respect for the specific value system, responsibilities to kin and elders, as well as recognising the strength and resilience of Indigenous communities is emphasised. The issue of competence is discussed in the guidelines, which highlights the importance of provision of services in a culturally competent manner and the need for appropriate cultural competence training. Psychologists also need to be aware that some Indigenous styles of interpersonal interaction may differ from those interaction styles of non-Indigenous people. The guidelines touch on psychological testing and assessment as well. For the APS, culturally appropriate psychological testing relates to understanding the variety of factors such as culture and language differences that may affect responses, as well as specific differences between customs and communication styles for certain communities where the tests are being administered.
Can you think of a real-world example that illustrates the principles you've been talking about?
Yeah, so I can tell you about a young girl that I visited recently, as her community and family members were quite worried about her and asked me to see her. I don't actually do many of my consultations at the clinic. It's very common that I actually go out to the client's house. When you visit the house of an ATSI person, you have to wait until they let you enter the house. You can never really enter in on your own accord. I waited outside the house and called the family member's name. We all came outside and sat under the tree together. The young woman was very quiet, did not talk much or make eye contact with me. I made sure that I didn't ask her any direct questions. The auntie and mother were in the consultation too, which is very common. They mainly spoke for her, and I directed my questions towards them to gain an insight into what was happening. They explained to me that she was upset because of sorry business, which is the term used to describe a family member's death. Under no circumstances is anyone actually allowed to use the deceased person's name. The family were explaining to me that the young girl hadn't eaten anything, had been cutting herself, which are known as sorry cuts. She'd been screaming and wailing during the day and hitting her head with a rock, which are all quite common when a family member dies. What we have to understand as non-Indigenous people is that the death response is very different. It would be inappropriate for me to suggest solutions that I would suggest to a non-Indigenous person. It is really important to be guided by what the family sees the problem as being and work with them to come up with a solution instead of opposing my own ideas. The family members and I decided that she would spend a few weeks up country connecting with the land again. Many Indigenous people have specific connections to the land which are very important to them and are a big part of their identity. There was a certain lake in the bush an hour away that this young girl had specific connections or a link to. Therefore, a group of family members we decided they would go with her out bush and visit this lake.
Thank you so much for your time tonight, Marissa. It's very much appreciated. In 2011, the APS formally committed to the development of a reconciliation action plan in partnership with the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association. This was done as a means of building respect, relationships and understanding between Indigenous and other Australians to close the gap in mental health. The plan identified 4 broad areas as priorities for action: respectful relationships, governance, cultural competence, and ATSI education and employment. Here tonight to talk to us about this and about the APS's 2016 formal apology to ATSI peoples, we welcome Professor Tim Carey. Hello Tim, thanks for being here tonight.
Hi Ellie and Jennah, thanks for having me. In September 2016, on behalf of the APS, I apologise to ATSI peoples for failing to meet their needs in the past. I acknowledge that Australian psychologists have not been culturally sensitive to the differences between ATSI and non-ATSI peoples. I apologise for diagnostic systems being used that failed to honour worldviews and cultural belief systems of the ATSI people, and that assessment procedures and techniques have produced inaccurate and misleading communications about their capacities and abilities. Further to this, Australian psychologists have wrongly developed and applied treatments, and we recognise that we made the error of failing to listen carefully enough to ATSI peoples. However, we endeavour to use the past as a lesson of how not to operate in ATSI communities, and have a number of goals that will guide us in achieving a united service provider and client.
So, what is the government's viewpoint about the importance of delivering culturally appropriate mental health services to ATSI peoples?
I think the federal government considers improving the long-term health outcomes of ATSI communities as an urgent priority in the health industry. As part of the Closing the Gap initiative, there is a national ATSI health plan from the year 2013 to 2023. This plan expressed the government's hope that more ATSI people will work in the mental health and social and emotional wellbeing workforces. Promoting the participation of ATSI peoples in the delivery of mental health services is a key driver moving forward. This is so that individual communities can better control care delivered to their people. Cultural competence can be further developed in mainstream mental health services with the collaboration of community elders and trained ATSI and non-ATSI health workers in the community. Increasing ATSI representation in the health industry could solve the issues of geographical isolation and language barriers that may impede ATSI access to mental health services. Additionally, psychological training and education for the general public within these communities could encourage self-determination.
Could you give us some examples of organisations and the work they're currently doing with ATSI communities?
Well, it has been found that ATSI peoples are more satisfied with the health services they receive when they combine traditional healer treatments with Western medicine. Last December, the Proud Spirit Declaration was announced by the National ATSI Leadership in Mental Health Organisation at the 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan. This document described a best of both worlds approach that combines clinical psychological practice with cultural healer and social and emotional wellbeing treatments. The message I keep coming back to fits with the vision expressed in the APS apology. With all ATSI communities, the APS wants to listen, to include, to follow, and to collaborate more. And these forms of reconciliation are key aspects of the APS ethical guidelines for psychological service provision for ATSI people.
You sound, Tim, like you really endorse collaborative approaches between government and ATSI peoples in all aspects of mental health work.
I'm optimistic that presently the APS, the federal government, and ATSI-run organisations are on the same page, and we want the past to remain in the rearview mirror as we continue to be united and collaborative working on these issues.
Thank you so much, Tim. Although there is still a lot of progress that needs to be made, there are a few initiatives already underway that are aimed at providing culturally appropriate mental health care to ATSI peoples. In 2010, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association developed a mental health specific cultural competency training called The Journey Towards Cultural Competence to educate health service providers working in ATSI communities and contribute to closing this gap in social and emotional wellbeing and mental health outcomes.
Deadly Thinking is another program that focuses on social, emotional wellbeing and suicide prevention. It's a one-day workshop specifically designed by ATSI peoples for ATSI peoples, confronting core social and mental wellbeing issues in a culturally appropriate, accessible and compelling way.
If you would like to donate to any of these initiatives, head to the project's website and follow the links.
Thanks for tuning in. Tomorrow night we'll be discussing mental health of the LGBTQ communities. Good night.